Okay, hopefully at this point you are comfortable in queuing a JavaScript file, even if you're not super comfortable with JavaScript. So the thing I want to talk about in this lesson are some of the JavaScript files, libraries, and dependencies like jQuery that are included with JavaScript, and you could easily reference them or use them in your own themes without having to include the library by yourself. So if we come over to the documentation for enqueue-script, which we've already looked at, and we could see the parameters here that we've looked at before. But if we come down a ways on the page, we'll get to default scripts included and registered by WordPress. And what that means is that WordPress core, as we call it, the core files that power WordPress include a ton of JavaScript libraries just to do what they do in the admin area and other places. So because of that, we could use anything that WordPress itself is already using in our theme. And if you're not familiar at all with JavaScript, some of this may be completely new to you, but if you have used a little bit of JavaScript here and there, you may recognize things like jQuery, jQuery Masonry, or Masonry, that library that lays things out on page, all the jQuery UI library, either an individual component or the entire jQuery UI library itself. We have some schedule, suggest thickbox, a color box or a pop-up light box, TinyMCE. Then there's a bunch of stuff we don't have links to, but we could still reference. Now, some of this stuff you probably wouldn't need to use because it's some of it being used by internal WordPress core, but some of these other libraries you may find helpful, JSON for JS. And then a list of ones that used to be here but are no longer there, like Prototype and Scriptaculous, which were kind of replaced by jQuery. So I want to point out that all of these exist so that if you do get into JavaScript and building things out with it, you aren't, for example, loading jQuery on your own because it's already in there. So we could reference, these are the handles. You just copy any of these into your dependency and it will now work with your site. So I'm going to focus on jQuery just because out of all of these, it's the most common and there are some issues with it that we do have to be aware of. So let's come back into our functions.php file for our theme. And we're inside our enqueue-scripts here, and I'm going to copy this and paste it below and comment out the top one because I want to replace this with a different demo. And I'm going to call this jQuery theme.js, and we're going to create a new theme file called jQuery.theme.js. It's going to do the exact same thing, just using jQuery instead. And here is the biggest change we have to make. This is where an array of dependencies go. So a collection of anything we want to make it dependent on. We already looked at it in CSS, so hopefully it already makes sense. But what we could do is type in the handle here, and that matches this handle here. So if we wanted to include Masonry, we just put Masonry there. If we wanted to do jQuery UI date picker or drag and drop, you would just copy this and paste it in. And if you had multiple ones, you could potentially pass it multiple. So let's say we had Masonry. Now I'm not going to code out all of that. I'm just going to show you a simple jQuery one, but I do want to point out that you could make multiple dependencies. Okay, so we've got jQuery loaded. Now let's come into our theme.js and save this as jQuery.theme.js. Now here's the thing I have to point out about jQuery. Normally when we select an object in jQuery, we would do something like single portfolio a.button, and this would give us the same thing as this here. In fact, behind the scenes, it's going to do something very similar to this, but it's a little bit shorter in jQuery and it's giving us some additional abilities. However, this $sign is a problem because jQuery is not the only library in the JavaScript world to use a $sign in its code. So if you have multiple files loaded on a page or multiple libraries that all use $sign, that is a problem. So for this reason, in WordPress, instead of using the $sign, you have to type out jQuery and then whatever it is. So anytime you would see a $sign in your jQuery, you'd have to replace that with this jQuery, and then it'll work. Now that could be a little bit cumbersome and annoying. So there is a kind of hack around this, or what's called a no conflict wrapper. And what we could do is actually leverage our, I'm going to remove this, we could leverage our IFI function, immediately evoked function. And what we could say is when you're about to call all of this code, pass in jQuery, but then when I use it in my code, pass it in as a $sign. So if you don't understand parameters and all this in JavaScript, it is completely fine. But just know that you will need to copy and paste this code, this kind of wrapper code here, if you want to use the $sign inside of your JavaScript. So now we could safely say single portfolio a.button, set the attribute of target equal to blank. And that should do the exact same thing that our previous JavaScript was, whether it's worth enqueuing jQuery in your theme for it. Probably not for this example, but there are times where it could be really helpful and useful. So let's come back and just make sure that this is working. So if I come into my site now and I click on it, it still opens it in a new tab, which is perfect. And if I were to come down and examine it, we could see, yep, that target blank is still there. Okay, perfect. So now we're at the point where you could really take this a step further, especially if you've played around with some jQuery before. So first step, catch up to where we are. Create a jQuery.theme.js, copy this code if you're not already familiar with it. And just again, I want to emphasize that you need this no conflict wrapper when working with jQuery if you want to use the $sign. Then inside of your functions.php, we commented out our old one because it's a duplicate of code. We enqueued our new one and we made it dependent on jQuery. Make sure you get all of this done on your own. And if you know a little jQuery, you've played around with it before, try to take this a little bit further. Now you could start adding some JavaScript libraries into your project. If they're not included with WordPress, you would just link to the main JavaScript file the same way we did, and then make whatever that is a dependency in your call to it or general theme one. So again, if you don't know a ton of JavaScript, don't worry about it. It may be that your project that you're building doesn't need any JavaScript, and that's common and fine. But if you know some, go ahead and pepper it in just for those added little benefits and things.